when cops found a body hidden under the floorboards. When the officers stepped into that small, rotting house on Maple Street, they thought they were responding to just another welfare check. But 30 minutes later, every one of them walked out changed. Because what they found hidden beneath those old wooden floorboards was something no amount of training could prepare them for. A secret sealed in darkness. A truth buried in silence. A body hidden where no one should ever end up. And the terrifying part? Someone had lived above it for months. The story begins long before the officers ever stepped onto the peeling porch of Claire Redding's home. To understand what happened inside that house, to grasp why the silence in those rooms felt so suffocating, you need to know who Claire was, who Mark was, and how their lives slowly intertwined into something that looked ordinary on the surface, but was anything but. Claire Redding was the quiet type, but not the lonely type. She was soft-spoken, gentle, almost shy, yet she had a warmth that made people trust her. She worked at a small community clinic just outside town, spending her days scheduling appointments, handing out paperwork, and offering kind smiles to patients who were often too nervous or too tired to offer one back. To her co-workers, she was dependable. To her neighbors, she was polite. To her family, she was the glue that kept everyone connected, even though she rarely asked for anything in return. She lived in a small house she inherited from her grandmother. It wasn't much, a single-story structure with faded blue paint and a roof that always seemed one storm away from collapsing. The type of home that had character but not comfort. Still, she loved it. It was hers. It was familiar. And most importantly, it was peaceful. Or at least, it used to be. 2 years before everything unraveled, Claire met Mark Dalton. He worked at a repair shop across town. A man with calloused hands and a temper he hid behind charming smirks. He was the kind of person who could be charismatic when he wanted something and cold when he already had it. People who knew him described him differently depending on when you asked. At first, he seemed confident, hardworking, protective. But with time, that confidence twisted into control. That protectiveness hardened into possession. Claire didn't notice the shift. Not at first. People like her, soft, trusting, hopeful, rarely do. In the beginning, Mark was attentive. He fixed things around her house without being asked. He brought her lunch at work. He drove her places even when she preferred to walk. Little things that seemed romantic until they weren't. Slowly, Claire withdrew. She stopped meeting co-workers after hours. She canceled family dinners. Her friends noticed bruises she brushed off as clumsiness. They noticed her phone was suddenly always on silent. They noticed she spoke less, smiled less, laughed less. Her sister noticed most of all. Whenever she called, Claire would answer quickly. Too quickly, as if someone was watching. Conversations became short, cautious, measured. Her sister would ask if she was okay, and Claire would always say yes. But her voice didn't sound okay. It sounded like someone trying not to say the wrong thing. By the time anyone realized something was deeply wrong, it was already too late. The last time anyone saw Claire was 12 days before the police appeared at her door. A neighbor remembered seeing her get groceries out of her car. She looked tired, distracted. Mark was standing behind her, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her every move. The neighbor waved, but Claire barely lifted her hand in return. She looked like someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark. Where her sister didn't hear from her for a week, she tried calling. No answer. She tried texting. Nothing. She sent messages that turned from casual check-ins to concerned questions to desperate pleas. Still no response. On the 9th day, she drove to Claire's job. Her co-workers said she hadn't shown up all week. No call, no text, no explanation. They assumed she was sick. But when they learned she wasn't answering anyone, not even family, they grew worried too. Her sister tried again, over and over, but every call went straight to voicemail. She knew something wasn't right. Claire never ignored her messages. Even on her worst days, even when she was overwhelmed, she always sent back at least a short reply. So her sister made the call she'd been avoiding, the call to the police. She reported her missing, explaining everything she knew. The officers on the phone listened carefully. They didn't dismiss her fear or brush it off with excuses. They told her they would perform a welfare check. And within the hour, A patrol car rolled quietly down Maple Street and parked in front of the old blue house. That house looked different now. Still familiar, but heavier somehow. As if the walls themselves knew something tragic had happened inside. The porch steps groaned under the officer's weight. Paint chips snapped off beneath their boots. The front door, once a soft shade of teal, was now faded and cracked from years of sunlight. When they knocked, no one answered. They knocked again, louder this time. Only after the third knock did they hear movement inside. Slow, shuffling, hesitant. A moment later, the doorknob turned, and Mark Dalton appeared in the doorway. He looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot, skin pale, almost grayish. A thin film of sweat coated his forehead, even though the air outside was cool. His voice was hoarse as he asked the officers what they wanted. They told him they were responding to a missing person report. Mark blinked, swallowed, said Claire wasn't home. He claimed she went to stay with a friend, though he couldn't provide a name. He said she left her car behind because it needed repairs. He said she took a cab, or maybe someone picked her up. He wasn't sure. Every sentence contradicted the last. His behavior, jittery, tense, defensive, put the officers on alert. Something was off. People react to stress differently, but this was more than stress. This was fear, a specific kind of fear. The officers asked if they could come inside. Mark hesitated. His eyes darted behind him, toward the dim hallway leading deeper into the house. His fingers tightened around the edge of the door, knuckles whitening. He said the house was messy. He said he wasn't expecting visitors. He said he needed a moment. The officers didn't budge. Eventually, Mark stepped aside. The smell hit them first. Not immediately. Not like a wave. More like a whisper. Something faint. Something rotten, trying to hide beneath layers of cheap air freshener and stale cigarette smoke. A smell they didn't want to recognize, but knew all too well. Inside, the living room was dimly lit. Curtains were drawn shut, trapped dust clouding the air. The room was cluttered, but not chaotically so. It was the kind of mess that happens when someone stops caring. Clothes draped over chairs. Dishes stacked in the sink. A mug half filled with something black and hardened. But it wasn't the mess that unnerved them. It was the stillness. Total, unnatural stillness. No humming appliances. No open windows. No signs of daily life. It felt like the house itself was holding a secret. One officer called out Claire's name. No answer. The officer tried again, louder. Silence. Each room echoed with the same uncomfortable emptiness. The hallway, the bathroom, the kitchen, everything felt frozen. Like time inside the house had paused 2 weeks earlier and hadn't moved since. Claire's purse sat on a small table by the door, untouched. Her wallet inside. Her ID. Cards neatly arranged. A set of keys beside it. Nothing a woman planning to stay with a friend would leave behind. On the kitchen counter sat her phone, dead, screen smudged with fingerprints. The officers asked Mark why her phone was there. He shrugged, said she forgot it. But Claire was known for being attached to that phone, especially because she always stayed in close contact with her sister. It made no sense. The more questions the officers asked, the more inconsistent Mark became. He kept repeating the same lines, the same excuses, as if he'd rehearsed them. He paced. He rubbed his hands over his hair. He avoided eye contact. One officer noticed scratch marks near the hallway wall, small indentations, fresh enough to still be sharp. Another officer noticed a patch of flooring in the living room that didn't match the rest. New wood, new nails, straight lines where everything else in the house was worn and crooked. Meanwhile, Mark stood near the doorway, watching every step the officers took, every drawer they opened, every corner they inspected. He wasn't just nervous. He was terrified, and the officers could feel it. The house felt wrong. Not just eerie or abandoned. Not just quiet. Wrong. The type of wrong that comes when something is hidden. Something big. Something dangerous. Every step the officers took closer to the living room floorboards made Mark twitch. He kept saying Claire was fine, that she just needed space, that she was coming back any day now. But the evidence around them said otherwise, because nothing about the house suggested Claire had gone anywhere. Her shoes were lined neatly by the door. Her jacket hung on the coat rack. A half-finished grocery list was still stuck to the fridge. Everything she used, everything she touched, everything she needed, all still there, except her. One officer finally asked the question they all were thinking. When was the last time you actually saw Claire? Mark didn't answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. That silence, heavy, thick, suffocating, hung in the room like fog. And that's when the officers knew. This wasn't a welfare check anymore. This was something else. Something darker. Something buried, not just beneath lies, but beneath wood. The officers exchanged glances. Their instincts, sharpened by years of training, all pointed to the same conclusion. Something terrible had happened inside this house. Something Claire never walked away from. And in that moment, standing in a room filled with still air, mismatched floorboards, and the faint, unmistakable scent of decay, they understood one chilling truth. Whatever happened to Claire, the answer was still inside this house. Hidden, buried, waiting to be found. Officers began a walkthrough of the home, calling Claire's name as they stepped slowly from room to room. Their voices echoed in the stillness, bouncing off faded wallpaper and empty hallways that felt strangely hollow, as if the entire house were holding back a secret. Claire? Claire Redding? Police department. We need to make sure you're okay. No answer. Just silence. Thick, heavy, unnatural. At first, nothing about the scene was dramatically alarming. The house was cluttered, yes, but in the way many lived-in places are: laundry in a basket near the dryer, a half-finished mug of tea on the coffee table, a book splayed open on the edge of the couch. But something subtle clung to the air, something the officers didn't immediately acknowledge, but felt instinctively. And then it hit them, slowly, quietly, like a whisper becoming a scream. That smell. It started faint, as though coming from somewhere deep within the walls, tucked into the corners of the house. A sourness, a heaviness, the kind of scent that seems to wilt the air around it. The officers exchanged glances, unspoken suspicion already forming between them. It was not the smell of rot from forgotten food, not the dampness of old pipes, not the staleness of a home left closed too long. This was different. The kind of odor that seized your stomach before your brain even understood why. The kind of smell that makes a trained officer's eyes sharpen, breath slow, and instincts kick into overdrive because they know what it usually means. Something was dead. One officer placed a hand over his nose for a second, discreet but telling. Another paused near the hallway, head tilting like he was trying to catch the direction the scent drifted from. They didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Not with Claire's boyfriend, Mark, standing just a few feet away, watching them with a stiff, unnatural posture. Mark was trembling, so subtly you might have mistaken it for nerves, the kind that come with police standing in your home. But this wasn't nervousness. It was something sharper, more brittle. Fear. Sir, one officer said to him gently. When did you last see Claire? Mark swallowed hard. I told you. She's been staying with a friend. Which friend? The officer asked calmly. I don't remember her name. Someone from work. And this friend hasn't contacted her sister or picked up her phone. Mark hesitated again. The officer studying him didn't miss it. His eyes tracked Mark's movements, the way he fidgeted, the way his gaze never met theirs for too long. Every behavioral alarm bell was ringing quietly beneath the surface. Look, she's fine, Mark muttered. She'll be back soon. But the officers had heard too many versions of that line. It never meant what the speaker wanted it to mean. They continued moving through the house. The kitchen was spotless, uncharacteristically so, according to Claire's sister, who had once joked that Claire's cooking always left behind a trail of chaos. The counters were wiped, scrubbed clean. Too clean. The bathroom was ordinary. The bedroom was messy, clothes scattered, makeup halfway open on the dresser. That looked normal, but the air felt wrong, stagnant, weighted. It was when they stepped into the living room that things changed. The smell was unmistakably strongest here. One officer crouched slightly, lips tightening. Another took a shallow breath through his mouth, a trick learned on the job to keep from gagging. And then, as they scanned the room, something caught their attention, a patch of the floor near the far wall. The boards were slightly different, newer, lighter in color, the nails still shiny. But even more telling was the way they were arranged. Not seamlessly, but with the faintest, clumsiest alignment, like someone trying too hard to make something look normal and failing. "Did you do repairs recently?" the officer asked without turning around. Behind them, Mark froze. His hesitation lasted just a second too long. Yeah, he said finally. "A few weeks ago. The boards were loose." The officer's eyes swept the rest of the room. Every other board was old, worn, darkened with age and scuff from years of footsteps. But this section, this one patch, stood out like a surgical scar. Another officer knelt down, pressing a palm against the new wood. Cold, smooth, wrong. The house seemed to go eerily quiet. Even the distant hum of the refrigerator felt muffled. "Sir," the lead officer said, his voice shifting into a firmer register, "I'm going to need you to step back from the living room." Mark's face drained of color. "Why? What are you?" "Step back." The officer's tone left no room for argument. Mark backed away slowly, his breath quickening, his hands shaking more visibly now. He looked toward the door, then toward the officers, then toward the floor, every movement twitchy, trapped. One officer nodded toward the others. "Something's under here." His partner moved to the hallway. "Give me a crowbar." Those words cracked the air open. Those were not words an officer used lightly. And Mark knew it. His shoulders sagged. His eyes darted again. His entire body seemed to fold inward, as if bracing for an impact he knew was coming. The crowbar arrived in seconds. The officer wedged it under the edge of the first board. A creak echoed through the house as old nails resisted. Then crack. The wood snapped upward. The smell surged out like a wave. Even the officers, trained, hardened, experienced, felt their stomachs twist. One turned away briefly. Another clenched his jaw. But still they continued. They always continued. The second board popped loose with a harsh, barking sound. The third came up easier. And then everything stopped. A stillness, cold and absolute, filled the living room. There, beneath the lifted boards, was plastic. Thick, tightly wrapped, folded with grim precision. The shape beneath the plastic was unmistakable. A shoulder, a curve of a torso, the outline of a human form that should have been breathing, living, laughing, moving, but was now nothing more than a silent shape entombed in darkness. One officer exhaled shakily. Another whispered, barely audible, "Oh, God." But the lead officer stayed steady, voice quiet but firm. "Call it in." He didn't need to say anything more. They all knew. Claire Redding. She had been here the entire time, under the feet of the man who claimed she was with a friend. Beneath the house, she worked so hard to make a home, hidden where no one should ever be hidden. And as the plastic was peeled back slightly to confirm identity, the truth settled in the air like a fog no one could clear. There she was. Claire's hair, matted but recognizable. Her arm, rigid from the final stages of death. Her clothing, still the same outfit she was last seen wearing. Everything about her presence beneath those boards screamed of a story far darker than an accident or a simple argument. As the officers processed the scene, emotions mixed in the room. Anger simmered. Sadness tightened throats. Disbelief hung heavy. But above all, there was a collective, unspoken resolve. They were going to find out what happened to her. Every detail, every lie, every truth buried with her. Mark stood in the corner, eyes hollow, breathing fast and uneven. When an officer moved toward him, he took a single step back, instinctual, like an animal trapped in a corner. "Mark Dalton," the officer said, "you need to come with us." "No," he stammered. "No, I didn't do anything." But the evidence was right there, under the floorboards, wrapped by hand, concealed with new wood purchased recently. Nails hammered in with trembling precision. He could protest. He could deny. He could claim anything he wanted. But the truth was literally beneath their feet. The officers guided him out of the house. As he stepped onto the porch, sunlight hit his face, but he shrank back from it, squinting like the light itself was too much for him. His knees looked ready to buckle. The lead officer, still inside, looked down at Claire's body one final time before stepping back. In that moment, something settled in him. A weight of responsibility. A promise. They were going to get justice for her. But they still had no idea just how twisted the story behind those floorboards would turn out to be, or how many secrets the house and the man who lived in it had been hiding. Because crimes like this don't happen overnight. They build, they grow, they simmer quietly behind closed doors until one final, irreversible moment. And in Claire's home, that moment had led to her being buried under her own living room, hidden where she was never meant to be found. But she was found, and justice, though delayed, had just begun to awaken. Mark Dalton was taken into custody the moment officers uncovered the body beneath the floorboards. But for the detectives assigned to the case, that moment wasn't the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. What lay ahead wasn't just an investigation. It was a journey into silence, deception, and the dark spaces people learn to hide inside their own homes. And as the days unfolded, the truth unraveled in ways no one on the investigative team could have predicted. The house was sealed immediately. Crime scene tape wrapped around the property like a warning to anyone who dared to step too close. Inside, investigators moved carefully, photographing every inch, dusting surfaces that hadn't felt a human touch in weeks, and collecting evidence that would eventually tell Claire Redding's story more accurately than any witness ever could. There was no escaping what the air inside that house revealed. It was thick with moisture, decay, and something else. Something that hung heavily over the investigators as they traced each room. The lingering sense that the home had been a prison rather than a refuge. As the forensic team worked inside, detectives shifted their attention to the people who knew Claire. The ones who might have seen or heard something, even unknowingly. Neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family were interviewed for hours. One by one, pieces of the puzzle surfaced. A neighbor across the street admitted she heard shouting on a night Claire disappeared. Shouting that was followed by a crash so loud it jolted her out of her sleep. Another neighbor, an elderly man who often sat on his porch late at night, said he noticed the lights flickering in Claire's house during the early hours of the morning between 1 and 3 o'clock. At first, he thought it might have been a wiring issue. But after hearing what happened, he realized those lights had not flickered. They had been turned on and off, over and over, as if someone inside the house was pacing, panicking, moving from room to room. One of Claire's co-workers shared that Claire had seemed distant during her last week at work. She showed up late twice, something she never did, and flinched when someone lightly touched her arm. When they asked her if everything was okay, Claire gave the same polite answer she always gave, but this time, her eyes didn't match her words. She looked tired, afraid, smaller than the version of herself they remembered. As each interview ended, detectives couldn't help noticing a recurring theme. Claire had been pulling away, emotionally and physically, from Mark in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She stopped attending gatherings, stopped answering calls after work, stopped laughing at jokes that once made her smile. Her world had become quieter and more controlled. But controlled by whom was becoming clearer with every person detectives spoke to. Back inside the station, as detectives pieced together these accounts, Mark sat in an interrogation room. The room was deliberately cold, illuminated by a single overhead light. Mark's hands were cuffed loosely in front of him, resting on a metal table that reflected the light in a sharp, unforgiving glare. For the first few minutes, he remained quiet, staring straight ahead as if replaying something in his mind, something he wasn't ready to confront. Detective Harris and Detective Lewis entered the room with a thick folder of evidence they had already collected. They placed it gently in front of Mark, but didn't open it immediately. They wanted him to feel its weight, to understand what was inside before they even turn a page. Mark, Detective Harris began, his voice calm, steady, almost gentle. We need you to walk us through what happened. Everything you say here matters. Mark blinked slowly, his expression unchanged. I told you, he said quietly. She left. I don't know where she went. Detective Lewis leaned forward. We found Claire, he said simply. The room changed instantly. Not physically, but emotionally. The weight of those words pulled something out of Mark's posture. His shoulders lowered. His hands tightened into fists against the metal table. He swallowed hard. Where? Mark finally asked. Detective Lewis didn't look away. Under the floorboards of your living room. Silence stretched between them, long and suffocating. Mark's breathing changed. It became shorter, uneven. He looked down at the table, not in grief, not in shock, but in calculation, as if his mind was scrambling to find an explanation he hadn't prepared for. Detective Harris opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, the image of the floorboards ripped open, revealing the tightly wrapped shape beneath them. He turned it around and slid it toward Mark. The suspect flinched, eyes darting away before he could take in the full image. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Mark muttered, his voice trembling now. "It wasn't. I didn't mean. Tell us what really happened," Detective Harris said quietly. The room held its breath. Mark pressed his palms to his forehead, dragging his fingers down his face, shaking slightly. His voice came out strained, jagged, trembling between anger and fear. "It was an argument," he finally said. "She was leaving me. I couldn't let her walk out like that. I lost control. It wasn't supposed to go that far." Detective Lewis scribbled something in his notebook, but his eyes remained focused on Mark. "After she died, what did you do?" Mark shut his eyes tightly, his voice cracking. "I panicked. I wrapped her up. I didn't know where to put her. I put her under the floor because I didn't know what else to do." Detective Harris didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply asked, "And then you kept living there?" Mark nodded barely. "I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. But detectives didn't know what else he had done. They knew he had lied to Claire's sister, telling her Claire had taken a break from her phone. They knew he had reported nothing, called no one, and continued going to work as if life were unchanged. They knew he had stepped over those floorboards every morning, slept above them every night, watched television mere feet from where he had placed her body. The evidence wasn't just stacked against him, it was overwhelming. The prosecution built their case meticulously. They recreated the timeline, supported by forensic analysis that left no room for doubt. The plastic wrap Mark used came from a roll found in the garage. The wood he used to replace the floorboards was purchased just days before he claimed Claire had left. Receipts confirmed it. Surveillance footage caught him at the hardware store. The tools he used, the saw, hammer, nails, all had fingerprints and trace evidence linking him to the concealment. Forensic experts examined the floor cavity where Claire was found. They analyzed moisture, insects, and temperature variations inside the sealed space. They concluded she had been placed there very shortly after her death. But what shocked the courtroom later was how long Mark had continued his normal routine afterward. Nearly 10 days passed before police arrived. 10 days of denial, of deception, of walking across the floor that hid everything he tried to bury. When the trial began, Claire's family walked into the courtroom united in grief. The seats behind the prosecution table were filled with people who loved her, people who remembered her laughter, her kindness, her softness. They clutched tissues, each other's hands, and photographs of Claire that felt heavier than anything they'd ever carried. Her mother refused to look at Mark when he entered. Her father, stiff and pale, stared straight ahead, jaw locked so tightly it trembled. The prosecution's opening statement painted a haunting portrait of Claire's final days. They spoke of fear, of control, of a woman trapped in a relationship that had slowly stolen her voice. They spoke of Mark's pattern of manipulation, the messages he intercepted, the calls he prevented, the fights neighbors overheard. They told the jury that Claire hadn't been living freely. She had been surviving. Mark sat beside his attorney, wearing a suit far too large for him, as if he were shrinking inside it. His eyes rarely rose to meet anyone's. When they did, they were empty, not with sorrow, but with the realization that every lie he crafted had finally collapsed. Witnesses were called. Claire's co-workers described the changes in her behavior. Neighbors described the terrifying noises from the house. A family friend described Claire's fear of confronting Mark about wanting to leave. Her sister, voice shaking but unwavering, recounted the final text she ever received from Claire, a message sent late at night, reading, "I think he knows I'm leaving." The courtroom fell silent after hearing those words. It was the kind of silence that cuts, raw, heavy, unspoken. Then came the forensic expert, the one whose testimony would become the turning point of the trial. He walked to the stand with the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times before, but even he seemed to hesitate before speaking. When asked to explain what he found beneath the floorboards, he didn't rush. He described Claire's placement, the position of her body, the wrapping, the lack of airflow, and environmental signs that told them exactly when she had been put there. His final statement froze the courtroom in place. She was placed under the floor shortly after she died. And based on the conditions inside the cavity, as well as the decomposition timeline, we determined that the suspect lived above her for nearly 10 days. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone in Claire's family let out a soft, broken cry. Even the judge paused before allowing the expert to step down. The prosecution's closing argument was measured, powerful, and devastating. They did not shout. They did not dramatize. They simply revealed the truth with the force of undeniable evidence. Claire didn't just lose her life, the prosecutor said. Her dignity was taken from her twice. First in the violence that ended her life, and again when she was hidden beneath the floorboards of the home she once believed was safe. The defendant didn't just panic. He planned. He purchased materials. He concealed. He lied. He slept mere feet above the woman he claimed to love. That is not an accident. That is not a moment of rage. That is not remorse. That is a choice. Then he looked directly at the jury. And your verdict will decide whether Claire's story ends in silence or injustice. Mark's attorney attempted to argue for manslaughter, insisting that the death had been unintentional, a heat-of-the-moment tragedy. But the evidence had already sealed the truth. Nothing about Mark's actions suggested panic. Everything suggested calculation, control, and cold attachment. The jury deliberated for hours, but those who sat outside the courtroom later said they knew the moment they walked back and that the decision had been made long before the door opened. Mark Dalton was found guilty on all major counts. Claire's mother broke into tears, her body collapsing into the arms of her daughter. Her father nodded slowly, his chin trembling as he wiped his eyes. Justice had finally spoken, not loudly but firmly. Mark sat expressionless as the verdict was read. He cleared his throat once, blinked twice, and stared forward as if waiting for someone to correct what he heard. But no correction came. As the judge dismissed the jury and the courtroom emptied, Claire's family stayed seated for a long time. They sat in silence, breathing through the weight of the moment, knowing that justice could never bring Claire back, but it could at least speak the truth she no longer could. And in the quiet that followed, as the doors closed behind Mark Dalton, one thing became painfully clear. Truth cannot remain buried forever. Not under lies, not under fear, and not beneath floorboards. It will always rise. But the truth, the real truth, came from a source no one had anticipated. It was not the forensic reports. It was not the confession in the dimly lit interrogation room. It came in the form of quiet, desperate messages from Claire herself. Messages she had sent to the one person she trusted above all, her sister. Weeks before her disappearance, Claire had begun to confide in her sister about the growing fear that had taken hold of her life. She described sleepless nights filled with the sound of Mark's footsteps pacing the house. She wrote about the sharp, cold anger in his eyes, the way his voice would lower when he was displeased, the way he could make her feel trapped even when the door was wide open. "She doesn't love me anymore," Claire had typed in one trembling text. "I think I'll do something if I leave. I packed a bag. I just don't know what to do." Her sister had kept those messages, not fully understanding their weight at the time. They had seemed like the venting of someone overwhelmed, someone needing support. But now, in the shadow of a crime no one could have imagined, they became a lifeline to the truth, a horrifying confirmation of what the investigators had begun to suspect. Claire's disappearance had not been random. It had been planned. The detectives revisited the evidence with this revelation in hand. They reviewed the surveillance footage from a neighborhood, the few times Claire had been seen leaving the house over the previous weeks. Each clip was scrutinized for signs of panic, of hesitation, of fear. And there it was, in the way she lingered at the doorway, the way her hand trembled as she tried to lock the car, the way her eyes darted toward the house before she drove away. The fear she had confessed to her sister was visible in every frame. Mark Dalton's defense had tried to frame the death as a tragic accident, a fight that escalated too quickly, a momentary lapse of judgment, a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. But the messages told a different story. Claire had planned to leave, and Mark had known it. The confrontation had been inevitable, and the evidence suggested he had been waiting, anticipating, preparing. And then there were the messages that came after Claire's disappearance. One particularly chilling text, sent to her sister from an unknown number, simply said, "Sometimes people have to learn their place. She won't be leaving now." The detectives connected the dots immediately. This wasn't just a fight. This was premeditation. This was control. This was obsession taken to its darkest extreme. In the courtroom, when these messages were read aloud, the atmosphere shifted. The jury, already tense, leaned forward as the screen displayed the text one by one. The words were simple, almost innocuous if read casually. But in context, they carried the weight of terror, of forewarning, of a life extinguished because someone refused to let another go free. And then came the physical evidence that compounded the psychological horror. Investigators had found traces of the same plastic wrap in Mark's car that had been used to bind Claire's body under the floorboards. They had discovered tools in the garage, tools bought the week before, carefully documented on receipts, that matched the method used to secure the floorboards above her corpse. It was a meticulous, calculated effort. Every step suggested planning, intent, and cold determination. Claire's sister took the stand, her voice breaking as she recounted the messages. Each one, each plea for help, each fearful declaration was laid bare in front of the court. She described how Claire had confided in her about every detail, the arguments, the intimidation, the way Mark would follow her around the house, ensuring she couldn't escape. The jury listened in stunned silence as the portrait of a controlled life, a life under constant surveillance and fear, slowly unfolded. She told me she couldn't leave him. Her sister said, tears streaming down her face. She said he would stop me if I tried. She was scared. She was terrified. And I couldn't protect her. The weight of those words hung in the courtroom like a physical presence. Even the seasoned detectives who had worked countless cases could feel the chill, the human cost of calculated violence, the cruelty of someone who could commit such a heinous act while pretending to live normally above the very body of their victim. The prosecution's team worked with precision, detailing the timeline of events. They showed how Mark's story crumbled under scrutiny, the inconsistencies in his account, the lies about Claire's last known activities, the implausible narrative of an accident. They demonstrated how, for days, Mark had gone about his normal life, cooking meals, turning on lights, walking the floors, all while the truth lay just beneath his feet. 10 days, 10 nights, 10 days of living above the woman he had killed, 10 days of pretending, of concealing, of denying the world the truth. The courtroom absorbed it all, stunned into silence. The jurors, confronted with this combination of confession, physical evidence, and the coldly methodical nature of the crime, faced a narrative too overwhelming to ignore. The story was no longer one of a simple domestic dispute. It was a chilling study in control, in manipulation, and in the absolute darkness a human heart can harbor. And then came the moment that defined the trial. The prosecution laid out the premeditation in meticulous detail. Every purchase, every preparation, every calculated move was described with precision. The jury saw the meticulous planning, the obsessive control, and the cold, heartless execution of a plan that should never have been conceived. Mark's defense faltered. His once confident demeanor crumbled. Each time a new piece of evidence was introduced, each time a new message was read aloud, his face tightened, the cracks in his armor becoming impossible to ignore. He realized that the story had been told, that the truth had been pieced together, and that the world now knew exactly what he had done. Finally, after weeks of testimony, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom held its collective breath. Mark Dalton was found guilty. Guilty on all major counts. Guilty of murder. Guilty of premeditation. Guilty of the cruelty and deception that had kept Claire's final days hidden from the world. Mark's face remained unreadable as the verdict was read, but outside, Claire's family finally exhaled the breath they had been holding for months. The grief, the fear, the unanswered questions, all of it began to shift into a bittersweet relief. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to honor the memory of Claire, enough to acknowledge the life that had been stolen, enough to ensure that her story would never again be silenced. The messages, the evidence, the confessions, they had transformed what could have been a tragic statistic into a narrative of truth. They reminded everyone in the courtroom, and everyone listening beyond it, that even in the darkest acts of human cruelty, truth has a way of emerging. Even when hidden beneath the floorboards, buried in secrecy and fear, the voice of the victim can eventually be heard. And though the horror of the crime would never fully leave the hearts of those who love Claire, the revelation ensured that her story would not fade. Her courage, even in fear, and the clarity of her warnings to her sister became the linchpin for justice. The twist of the case, that the victim had, in a sense, been trying to save herself, had been trying to warn the world, made the conclusion both devastating and hauntingly powerful. This revelation, more than anything else, cemented the case in the minds of everyone involved, that justice, while sometimes delayed, can emerge from the shadows. That a single voice, a cry for help, a message sent in desperation, can illuminate a darkness too long hidden. And that even the most meticulously planned crimes, carried out with cold precision, can eventually be unraveled by the truth. Mark Dalton's conviction became more than a legal outcome. It was a story about human resilience, about the bond between sisters, about the capacity for justice to prevail even when the odds seem impossibly stacked against it. It was a story about Claire, a life stolen, yes, but also a life that, through her courage, ensured that her abuser could not continue in silence. Guilty, on all counts, and in those words, a measure of peace for those left behind. In the end, the house on Maple Street was torn down, but the memory of what happened there remains. A reminder that even the quietest homes can hide the darkest secrets, and that sometimes the truth isn't buried deep, it's buried just beneath our feet. Justice arrived late for Claire, but arrived, and her story will not be forgotten. This was another story from True Justice Stories. If you found this video powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real tales where truth meets justice.